Over the past 10 years or so, we've seen the left move at lightning speed away from many of the core principles it used to defend. The left now appears to support censorship over freedom of speech, equality of outcome over equality of opportunity, color-conscious anti-racism over color-blind anti-racism, experts and authority over skepticism and the scientific method. In this series of videos, I will attempt to illustrate this as rationally as I can, while providing as many sources as I can. I know it's not all of the left, and I usually dislike broad sweeping generalizations, but at this point I think it's enough of the left that the generalization applies. Since the BLM movement started gaining mainstream popularity, around 2013 and 14, more and more people on the left appear to have shifted their beliefs about racial discrimination and racial inequality from believing in a colorblind society to believing in a color-conscious one, with the biggest shift happening during 2020 in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. One of the central claims of both the BLM movement and the organization is something along the lines of, police are racist because they shoot and kill a disproportionately high number of unarmed black people. And you would be hard-pressed to find any leftist or even a normie who doesn't believe this, because, well, it's been all over the media for the past few years. What is racism? The dictionary states it is the belief that one race is superior or inferior to another, but I prefer the way the word is colloquially used, which is simply to mean racial discrimination or prejudice. According to the best source on police killings, the Washington Post database, the police kill anywhere between 11 and 22 unarmed black people every year. So just starting here, I have no idea how BLM can confidently make such a sweeping statement about the entire police based on a sample size of 20. In a country where there's 10 million arrests per year, how can you look at something that happens 20 times and go, yep, the police are racist? Just FYI, 20 out of 10 million is 0.0002%. I think it's safe to say the police are mostly peaceful when it comes to killing innocent black people. But whatever, let's indulge in this line of thinking. The rate of black people that are killed by police is disproportionately higher than white people when compared to their numbers in the overall population. That's true. However, the simple existence of a disparity doesn't mean anything. We need to analyze what actually causes that disparity. I want to make a quick aside here to point out a really common trend you'll find in the current discourse. When people see a disparity and claim racism, do they mean that the disparity is caused by racism? Sometimes yes, but many on the left seem to have gone further and redefined racism to be synonymous with racial disparities. So in their view, it's not that racial disparities are caused by racism, it's that racial disparities are racism. This is evident not only in the way people talk about these subjects, but also academically with authors such as Ibram X. Kendi in his book How to Be an Anti-Racist, where he states that every single policy, and yes, he really does mean every single one, is either racist or anti-racist based on its outcomes. If it produces a disparity favorable to black people, it's anti-racist, otherwise it's racist. And according to him, there are no neutral policies. I'm going to disregard this line of thinking entirely, because redefining racism, a word that has a very concrete meaning, is illogical to begin with, and even if you do that, you're still referring to the same underlying concept, disparities, which aren't intrinsically good or bad. In fact, if the system is working as intended, by allowing the freedom of choice, rewarding merit, and not imposing artificial barriers, then a disparity can be good, actually. It means people are doing what they chose to do, not what they were forced to do. Unless we're supposed to assume that the massive disparity in the NBA, for example, where 70% of players are black, is bad. To me, it looks like it's working exactly as intended. There seems to be a higher number of black people who like basketball and are good at it. Therefore, there's more black players in the best teams. Nothing wrong with that. There's also plenty of areas in our lives where we intentionally try to create disparities. if you study a lot to get good grades, you're intentionally trying to create a disparity between yourself and the rest of your colleagues so that you can possibly get into better universities, get a better job, have a better quality of life. Because you know that universities don't have infinite spots. So if you want to get in, you need to be better than the other people who don't get in. So, coming back to the disparity in police killings, I think it's safe to assume that police officers interact more with people who commit crimes, so we can take a look at arrest statistics published by the FBI to try and make sense of these numbers. I found this Reddit post which summarizes the FBI data really well and presents it in a slightly more readable format, but rest assured, all of the data is based on the official FBI Universal Crime Report statistics. Both sources will be linked in the description. So if we take a look at this table, which has the percentage of arrests by race for each type of crime, and also calculate the rates per 100,000 in the overall population, we can see that black people are arrested for almost all crimes at rates much higher than white people. Particularly for murder, which is one of the bigger extremes, blacks are arrested for 51% of all murders, even though they make up only 14% of the population, while whites are arrested for 45% of murders when they make up 60% of the population. Robbery is similar, but for other crimes the difference isn't as large. However, the rates per 100,000 are still much higher for blacks across almost all crimes, and the overall rates are actually comparable to the rates of police killings. I think it's logical to assume that the rates of mistakes, i.e. police killing unarmed suspects, would be proportional to the rates at which police interact with and arrest suspects overall. And this data seems to bear that out. But arrests are not convictions, I may hear you say. True. Let's look at the prison population then. When it comes to incarceration rates per 100,000, we can once again see that blacks are convicted at much higher rate than whites. In this case, the difference is actually much larger. Whereas before, the rates were around 2.6 times higher for blacks, when it comes to incarceration, it's almost 5 times higher. So almost every statistic we turn to seems to indicate that these disparities exist because there's a disparity in crimes committed. Unless someone can make a really compelling argument or show a study explaining how all of this is caused by racial prejudice or racial bias in the rules or the people involved, then I'm simply not convinced that the justice system, and more specifically the police, are racist. At this point in the conversation, many people, including real-life friends and acquaintances of mine, have claimed, but if the police is racist, then we can't trust their data, so we can't conclude from the data you just showed that they are not discriminating. And, the only possible response at that point is, if the data isn't good enough, according to you, then we can't make any conclusions one way or the other. If the best quality data we have is not good enough to prove their innocence, then it's definitely also not good enough to prove their guilt. And a point that's really important to highlight on this subject is that the people most affected by all of this are in fact black people themselves. 88% of black homicide victims are killed by other blacks. And it gets worse. Black people are the only demographic where homicide is in the top 10 causes of death, according to data published by the CDC. Homicide is the 20th most common cause of death for white people, but it's the 7th most common for black people. Almost 3% of all black people who die every year die by homicide, while only 0.2% of white people who die by homicide. Even though white people make up 60% of the population, they only make up 30% of homicide deaths, while black people make 14% of the population and 52% of homicide deaths. And as we've seen earlier, roughly 88% of those deaths are caused by other black people. And we can do the calculations per 100,000 as well. Black people are murdered at a rate of 248 per 100,000 every year, while whites had a rate of 27 per 100,000. And that's a 9 times difference. So that is much higher than the difference between arrests and police killings of white and black people. So when almost 10,000 black people are killed every year, 8,800 of whom are killed by other black people, being afraid of police because they kill 20 unarmed black people is crazy. Unjustified police killings are 0.2% of all black homicides each year. Oh, and this whole time, I have even accepted BLM's framing, where they assume that unarmed equals innocent, which isn't always the case. One final point on crime that I think is very important to emphasize, not only because it's an important point in and of itself, but also because the left often likes to shoot the messenger and claim that anybody who talks about these statistics is only doing so to try and paint all black people as criminals, which is definitely not the case, is that the vast majority of black people are not criminals. According to the very same FBI data we just saw, 95% of black people don't commit any crimes on a given year. Similar story for all ethnicities, really. 98% of white people don't commit crimes, 97% of Hispanics don't commit crimes, and 99% of Asians don't commit crimes. So it's a tiny minority of people who commit the overwhelming majority of crimes, and that is true for all skin colors. And that only gets crazier the more you think about it. If only 5% of black people commit crimes, and 14% of the population is black, that means it's not 14% of the population committing 50% of the murders, it's actually 0.7% of the population committing 50% of the murders. Think about how crazy that is. Another argument leftists usually move to in this point in the conversation is, yes, but black people only commit more crimes because of their socioeconomic conditions, which are caused by systemic racism and the legacy of slavery, redlining, and Jim Crow. And okay, that's a fair argument and an important conversation to have, but it's a different conversation from the one we were having just until now. The original claim was that the police was racist, but suddenly when the data doesn't support that, the goalposts shift to socioeconomic conditions. That's a different topic entirely. But that's okay, we can go down this rabbit hole too. And this will tie back nicely to the point about disparities, since disparities by themselves don't really mean anything, and we can find disparities across almost any metric and across almost any groups we decide to measure. So the median household income in the US, across all races and ethnicities, is around $69,000 per year. Nice. For whites, it's $74,000, and for blacks, $46,000. Now, that's a big difference. But if we keep scrolling down a bit further to find the table on detailed ancestry, you will notice that certain subgroups of black Americans actually make much more than the average for black Americans as a whole, and even much more than the average for white Americans. It is absolutely true that one of the reasons why black Americans today are not doing as well as they could be is because they started out further behind, due to slavery, Jim Crow laws, etc. But the argument that systemic racism is still today one of the main limiting factors starts to lose a lot of credibility when you look at, for example, Nigerian Americans having a median household income of $78,000 per year. Even if African Americans born today start behind their white counterparts, they are still much further ahead than Nigerians. In Nigeria, standards of living are way lower, education levels are way lower, and yet, somehow, Nigerians who immigrate to the United States seem to be largely unaffected by systemic racism, so much so that they earn even more than whites. So they started out even further behind than African Americans, and somehow they ended up doing better than white Americans? How does systemic racism, which supposedly brings down all black people, somehow affect some groups of black people, but not others? Could perhaps other factors be at play, which have a much larger effect on outcomes, like mindset and culture? And if you're weary that I'm using Wikipedia because it's not a reliable source, I understand you, and I agree with you. But what Wikipedia does do pretty well is cite their own sources. So if you think something Wikipedia says is questionable, you can go to the primary sources directly and double check, which is what I did. All of this data comes from the government census website. I just thought that Wikipedia presented it in a more readable format. Like I said, all sources will be linked in the description, so you can check them out for yourself.
What is the cost of lies? It's not that we'll mistake them for the truth. The real danger is that if we hear enough lies, then we no longer recognize the truth at all.